The first warning did not come from an American report or a naval intelligence file. It came through Japanese radios in the middle of a fight, spoken in disbelief at high altitude over the Pacific. Calm voices suddenly tightened, and experienced pilots said something that made no sense to them at the time. They reported that American fighters were climbing like Zeros. For men who had ruled the skies since 1941, that sentence carried a quiet fear. It meant something had changed, and it meant the air war they thought they understood was no longer theirs to control. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval pilots felt untouchable. From Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, they flew with confidence built on long training, combat experience, and a fighter that seemed unbeatable. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero could climb fast, turn inside almost anything, and stay in the air longer than its enemies. American pilots knew this well. Many of them learned the hard way that trying to dogfight a Zero was often a mistake that ended in fire and smoke over blue water. By late 1942, however, American commanders knew that matching the Zero turn for turn was not the answer. They needed an aircraft that could absorb damage, dive faster, climb hard when needed, and kill quickly. That demand landed on the desks of engineers at Grumman, who had already earned a reputation for building tough naval aircraft. What they produced would not look elegant or light. It would look heavy, wide, and almost brutal. And that was exactly the point. The aircraft was the F6F Hellcat. It first flew in June 1942, but it was designed with a single enemy in mind. Every line, every bolt, and every system reflected lessons written in blood during the first year of the war. American pilots did not need another fragile aircraft that demanded perfect flying. They needed something that would forgive mistakes and still bring its pilot home. The Hellcat was built to do that and more. When the first production Hellcats reached fleet squadrons in early 1943, many pilots were unsure. It was heavier than the Wildcat. It felt different. The engine was massive, the wings thick, and the cockpit sat high. But the moment they pushed the throttle forward, doubts faded. The aircraft surged ahead with a kind of strength they had not felt before. It did not float, it did not wobble, it climbed with purpose. The first real encounters came in the spring of 1943 near the Solomon Islands. Japanese pilots from the Imperial Japanese Navy were still flying aggressive patrols, confident in their skills and aircraft. Many of them were veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and Coral Sea. They had faced American fighters before and expected the same patterns. Instead, they found something new rising toward them from below. In one early engagement near Bougainville, Japanese pilots reported American fighters climbing to meet them instead of diving away. That alone was strange. For months, Americans had avoided vertical fights with Zeros. Now they were pulling up hard, engines roaring, refusing to give altitude. The surprise grew worse when American aircraft did not stall or fall away. They kept climbing. Radio calls followed quickly. Japanese pilots described the American fighters as heavy but powerful, fast in the climb, and dangerous in the dive. Some compared the climb to their own Zero, a comparison that would have sounded impossible just months earlier. These reports were not exaggeration or panic. They were accurate observations made by skilled men who knew the air well. The reason was simple but deadly. The Hellcat carried the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower. That engine allowed the aircraft to climb at more than 3,000 feet per minute under combat conditions. It was not just raw power. The Hellcat's weight helped it maintain momentum in vertical moves where lighter aircraft lost speed quickly. Japanese pilots were seeing a fighter that could fight in the vertical and survive mistakes. At the same time, American pilots were learning how to use the Hellcat correctly. Training emphasized discipline, teamwork, and energy tactics. They were told not to turn with Zeros unless absolutely necessary. Instead, they climbed, dove, fired short bursts, and climbed again. The aircraft allowed them to do this repeatedly without falling apart or running out of power. By mid-1943, these encounters became more frequent. Over Rabaul, the skies began to tilt. Japanese pilots noticed that American fighters were not only climbing well, but also absorbing damage. Hits that once would have shredded earlier aircraft now left Hellcats flying. Armour protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fires. This changed the psychology of combat. American pilots could press attacks longer. Japanese pilots began to feel pressure they had not felt before. One Japanese after-action report from late 1943 described American fighters that refused to disengage and returned after damage. That kind of endurance was unsettling. The Zero had been designed for range and agility, not survival. In earlier years, that trade-off made sense. By 1943, it was becoming a weakness. The shift became undeniable in November 1943 during the carrier strikes against the Gilbert Islands. Hellcats flew cover for American bombers and ships, meeting Japanese interceptors head-on. In these battles, Japanese pilots again reported American fighters climbing aggressively into combat, not waiting below. Some pilots radioed warnings to others to avoid vertical chases, advice that would have been unthinkable in 1941. American pilots also noticed the change. Many wrote later that this was the first time they felt they had a clear advantage in the air. They no longer feared being dragged into slow-turning fights. The Hellcat gave them options. If a fight went wrong, they could dive away at high speed. If they had the energy, they could climb and reposition. The aircraft responded without protest. By early 1944, the Hellcat had become the backbone of American carrier air power. Squadrons rotated through combat zones with increasing confidence. Japanese losses rose steadily, not just in aircraft, but in experienced pilots. Training pipelines in Japan could not replace them fast enough. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours and less confidence, facing an enemy that was learning faster every month. This growing gap set the stage for what would become the decisive air battle of the Pacific. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, hundreds of Hellcats met Japanese carrier aircraft in the largest carrier clash in history. Many Japanese pilots went into that battle already aware of the Hellcats' reputation. They had heard the radio calls, they had read the reports, they knew the Americans now flew fighters that could climb like Zeros and hit far harder. One American pilot who would become central to this story was David McCampbell, a disciplined and methodical officer who understood energy fighting perfectly. Flying a Hellcat, he would later demonstrate exactly why Japanese pilots had begun to fear this aircraft. But even before individual heroes emerged, the outcome was becoming clear. The Hellcat was not just another fighter. It was a system, a symbol of a learning force that had adapted and returned stronger. By the end of the Philippine Sea battle, Japanese carrier aviation was effectively broken. The phrase Great Marianas Turkey Shoot entered history, reflecting how one-sided the fighting had become. Behind that nickname lay years of learning, engineering, and tactical change. And at the center of it all was the moment Japanese pilots first realized something was terribly wrong, when American fighters climbed up toward them, refusing to stay below, moving like aircraft they thought only Japan possessed. By the summer of 1944, the shock had worn off, but the fear had not. Japanese pilots no longer sounded surprised on the radio when American fighters climbed with them. Now they sounded cautious. Warnings replaced confidence. Veterans told younger pilots not to chase upward, not to follow Americans into vertical moves, and not to expect the old advantages to save them. The air war had entered a new phase, and many Japanese pilots sensed it was slipping out of their control. For American squadrons, the Hellcat was no longer new. It was trusted. Pilots knew its limits and strengths. They knew exactly how hard they could pull, how steep they could climb, and how fast they could dive without losing control. That confidence mattered. In air combat, Hesitation often meant death. The Hellcat reduced hesitation because it responded the same way every time. It did not surprise its pilot in the wrong moment. Training played a huge role in this shift. By 1944, American naval aviation training was intense, standardized, and constant. Pilots arrived at the front, already familiar with combat tactics against Japanese aircraft. They practiced boom and zoom attacks, high-speed slashing passes, and coordinated group maneuvers. They were taught to fight as units, not as lone hunters. The Hellcat fit this philosophy perfectly. Japanese training, meanwhile, struggled. Fuel shortages reduced flight hours. Experienced instructors were lost in combat. New pilots often reach frontline units with only basic skills. They were brave, but bravery could not replace experience. Facing Hellcats flown by confident, well-trained pilots, many found themselves overwhelmed in their first combat. The physical differences between the aircraft only widened the gap. The Hellcat carried 650 caliber machine guns with heavy ammunition loads. A short burst could tear through wings, engines, and cockpits. The Zero, lighter and more delicate, could not absorb that punishment. Japanese pilots learned quickly that being hit once was often enough to end the fight. The same time, Hellcat pilots discovered they could survive hits that would have killed them in earlier aircraft. Bullets punched holes through wings without causing structural failure. Fuel tanks sealed themselves. Engines kept running even when damaged. Pilots returned to carriers with aircraft that looked barely flyable, yet they walked away alive. That survival rate fed morale and experience, creating a cycle that favored the Americans more with every month. One of the most telling moments came after the Philippine Sea battles. Japanese intelligence summaries noted that American fighters were now superior in climb, speed, and firepower at most altitudes. This was an extraordinary admission from a force that had once dominated the skies. The Zero was still agile, but agility alone could no longer decide the fight. As the war moved closer to Japan itself, Hellcats escorted strikes over the Philippines, Formosa, and Okinawa. Japanese pilots continued to fight, but the tone had changed. Encounters were shorter, deadlier, and less forgiving. American fighters controlled when and how combat happened. They climbed when they wanted, dove when they wanted, and disengaged at will. The phrase first heard in surprise became part of grim acceptance. American fighters climbing like Zeros was no longer shocking. It was expected. And worse, they did everything else better too. Faster dives, heavier guns, stronger frames, better radios, better coordination. The skies were no longer a place where Japanese pilots felt at home. By the end of the war, the Hellcat would be credited with destroying more enemy aircraft than any other naval fighter in history. But numbers alone do not tell the full story. Its true impact was psychological. It took away the confidence that had carried Japanese aviation through the early years of the war. It replaced fear with caution, and caution with defeat. For American pilots, the Hellcat represented a turning point. It marked the moment. They stopped reacting and started controlling the fight. It gave them the freedom to think, plan, and survive. Many later said that flying the Hellcat felt like finally having the right tool for the job. And it all began with that moment in the sky, when Japanese pilots looked up, saw American fighters rising toward them, and realized the rules had changed. In that instant, the balance of air power shifted, quietly but permanently. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.